Picture a boy of about 15 standing in a hall of polished stone he has never seen before, in a city that is not his own, surrounded by a language he cannot yet speak. Hundreds of miles behind him, the walls of Jerusalem are still standing in shock. His family has been torn away from him. His name is about to be taken and replaced with another, and in front of him, laid out across a long table dressed for royalty, sits the richest food he has ever seen in his life. Meat from the king's own kitchen, wine measured out from the king's own cellar. Everything a frightened, hungry captive could possibly want, offered to him freely. And this boy is about to refuse it, not because he is not hungry, because he is starving. Not because the food is rotten or poisoned in any way a physician today would point to, because by every appearance on that table it is flawless. He is going to look at the food of the most powerful man alive, while standing inside that man's own palace, and say that he will not touch it. And the detail that has kept people turning this story over for more than 2,000 years is not the refusal by itself. It is what happened to his body afterward. 10 days after he pushed that food away, something showed on his face that nobody in the palace had predicted. Something the king's own official could see plainly, standing in arm's length in front of him. And it quietly set in motion what may be the earliest written account we have of a controlled test run on the human body. A group that changed one single thing. A group that changed nothing at all. A fixed count of days agreed in advance. And a result that somebody thought important enough to write down and keep. The boy's name was Daniel. Stay with me all the way to the end, because the number that lands at the close of his story, a 10 that the old text repeats, is the exact thing that modern researchers went hunting for. And what a laboratory in the American South turned up thousands of years later is very hard to wave away. Let me take you back to how a boy from Jerusalem ended up standing in that hall at all. Daniel did not arrive there by choice. He arrived at the end of a march. Picture the long road out of Judah, the dusty column of the captured moving north and east, away from everything they had ever known, toward a skyline they had heard about only in fearful rumor. The temple behind them stripped bare, the gold vessels that had held holy things now packed away as loot bound for a foreign god's treasury. And walking somewhere in that column, a handful of boys from good families, still young enough that the full weight of what had happened to them had probably not landed yet. By the time it did, they were already inside the walls of the city that had swallowed their world. The year, in the way we count time now, sits close to 600 before Christ. Babylon is not yet a symbol. It is not yet the word we reach for when we mean pride and ruin. It is a living city, and for this moment, it is the center of the entire world. Its walls are said to be so broad that 2 chariots could pass one another along the top of them. Its blue gates shine with glazed brick. Its gardens will be remembered as a wonder for as long as people keep lists of wonders. At the head of all of it sits Nebuchadnezzar, a king whose army has just closed its hand around the small and stubborn kingdom of Judah and lifted its capital off the map. When a king like that conquered a people, he did not only strip the gold and silver out of their temple, he carried off their future. He took the children of the nobility, the sharpest and best formed of the young, the ones who would have grown into leaders and priests and advisors. He brought them back to his own palace, and he set about remaking them from the inside out. A new language for their mouths, new books for their minds, new names that honored his gods in place of the God of their fathers. 3 years of the finest schooling the ancient world could offer. And at the far end of it, a class of brilliant young foreigners who owed everything they had become to Babylon. Daniel was one of these. So were three companions the story keeps close beside him, boys we will come back to before the end. They were chosen for one reason above all the others. There is nothing wrong with them. The text is oddly careful about this point. They were healthy, quick to learn, pleasing to look at, fit to stand in a royal court, raw material of the very highest grade. Their names carried God right inside them, the way names in that world were meant to. Hananiah, the Lord shows grace. Mishael, who is what God is. Azariah, the Lord helps. Daniel himself, God is my judge. Four names that pointed every single time they were spoken aloud back to the God of the very people Babylon had just crushed. So Babylon changed them. Daniel became Belteshazzar, a name bent toward the god Bel. The other three became the names most of us know far better than their real ones, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, each one leaning toward a Babylonian god. It sounds like a small thing, a clerk swapping one label for another. It was not. A name in the ancient Near East was not a tag you wore. It was a claim about who made you and who you belonged to. Every time one of these boys answered to his new name, Babylon was writing over the old one syllable at a time. And the plan for them did not stop at their names. It reached all the way to their plates. Day by day, a fixed portion was assigned to them from the king's own food and from the same wine that the king himself drank. The word the old text uses for that royal food is a rare one, a borrowed palace term for delicacies, the choicest portions set aside for a monarch. This was not survival rations. This was abundance engineered to bind. Rich meats, the fat of the land, dishes built by cooks whose only task in life was to please the most powerful palate in the world, and wine poured to match. A boy raised on the plain bread and simple fare of a captive people had never seen anything like it in his life. To refuse it once, in a single moment of nerves, is one thing. To refuse it every day, meal after meal for 3 years, while it steams in front of you and everyone around you leans in and eats, is a different kind of resolve altogether. Here is where you have to slow down and feel the true weight of it. Because from where we sit today, the whole thing can look like a teenager being difficult about a menu. It was nothing remotely like that. To be handed food straight from the king's table was not an insult in that world. It was the very opposite. It was the favor of the highest kind. It was the safest, richest, most envied position a captive could ever fall into. To turn it down was not to turn down a meal. It was to turn down the king himself silently at his own table, in front of the men he trusted to carry out his orders. And the official caught in the middle of that refusal had his own life to weigh against it. What could possibly be worth that kind of risk to a boy who had already lost his home, his family, and even his name? The answer runs deeper than taste and deeper than pride. For Daniel, the king's food was not clean. Some of it came from animals his people had always been forbidden to eat. Much of it had almost certainly been offered first to Babylon's gods before it ever reached the table, which meant that to swallow it was, in a quiet and private way, to bow. The wine carried the same shadow. To eat and drink from that table was to let Babylon reach past his mind, past his language, past his stolen name, all the way down into his body, and write itself there too. That was the one border this boy would not let them cross. And think for a moment about what everyone in that palace simply assumed would happen next. Take the meat and the wine away from growing boys. feed them nothing but vegetables and plain water, and of course, they would fade. Of course, they would weaken. The rich food was the strong food. The king's table was where strength came from. Everyone knew that. It was as obvious to them as it still feels to many of us standing in a kitchen today. Which is exactly why what happened would make no sense to a single person who watched it. So Daniel made a request that should have cost him everything. He went to the chief official, a man the text says had already come to like him, and asked to be excused from the royal food and the royal wine. He asked in his own words, not to be defiled. And Daniel was not standing alone in this. That matters. The same three friends had made the same choice. 4 boys lined up against a kingdom, which meant the risk was never 1 neck, but 4, and the official's fear multiplied to match. It is easier to hold a line when someone is holding it right beside you. Whatever gave Daniel the nerve to ask, the other 3 had found it too. And the official was afraid, openly. He said as much, right to Daniel's face. His fear was not cruelty. It was arithmetic. The king had assigned this food with his own authority. If these 4 boys grew thin, if their faces turned hollow and gray beside the others who were eating like princes, the king would see it. And when he asked why his hand-picked students looked half-starved, the blame would fall on one head, the head of the man who had let them wander off the plain. "I fear, my lord the king," he said. "He would have my head because of you." That should have been the end of it. A frightened official, an order handed down from the throne itself, and a boy with no leverage of any kind. Refusal denied. But Daniel did not argue with the man's fear. He did something far more interesting. He offered to settle the question the same way we would still try to settle it today, with a test. And keep one thing in the back of your mind as this plays out, because it matters far more at the end than it does right now. Nobody in this story is trying to prove anything about food. Daniel is not running an experiment for the sake of curiosity or knowledge. He is trying to hold a line he believes he was born to hold. The science, the part a laboratory would go on to confirm so many centuries later, was never his aim. It was a side effect of his conviction. Hold on to that, because it is exactly what makes the result so hard to explain away. He turned to the steward. The man sat directly over the 4 of them from day to day. Some readings of the text even give this guardian a name, Melzar, the one who now had a dangerous little secret to keep. And Daniel laid out his terms so precisely that they read almost like a note pinned to a laboratory door. "Test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then, at the end of it, look at our faces and look at the faces of the young men who are eating the royal food, and deal with us according to what you see." Read that slowly, because there is far more hiding inside it than a diet. There is a fixed length of time, 10 days agreed before anything begins. There is one thing being changed, the food, and one thing only. There is a group still eating the ordinary royal diet, left there in the background, unchanged for the sake of comparison. And there is a clear, observable outcome named out loud in advance, the appearance of their faces and their bodies, with a real decision hanging on the result. Change one thing. Hold everything else steady. Compare against the group that did not change. Then judge by what you can actually see. That is the bare skeleton of a controlled experiment. And it was written down by the traditional reckoning more than 2,000 years before the careful clinical trials that our medical textbooks like to point back to as the beginning of the method. Here is the small promise I will make you before we cross into what happened. In a few minutes, you are going to hear what a research team in the American South found when they took this exact pattern of eating, vegetables and water, no wine and no rich meat, and ran it on modern adults, with modern instruments measuring the modern markers of disease. The numbers they carried back lined up with this ancient story so closely that the researchers themselves chose their words with real care. But first, the 10 days. The steward listened, and for reasons the text quietly leaves us to wonder about, he agreed to try it. Only for 10 days, off the record unofficially, with his own position resting on 4 teenagers and a pile of plants. So the clock started. Imagine those first evenings, the long tables filling with the smell of roasted meat and poured wine, the other young men settling in to eat like the favored sons of an empire, and 4 boys at the edge of the room reaching instead for a bowl of plain vegetables and a cup of water. Every meal a small, quiet act of defiance that almost no one else even noticed. And somewhere along the wall, the steward watching their faces the way a man watches a fire he is not sure he can still control, counting down the days, wondering each morning whether this would be the one where the color began to drain out of them and his own future started to slip. 10 days. Said out loud, it sounds like nothing at all, but 10 days is long enough for a body to begin answering a question that has been put to it. And it is long enough for a lie to show itself, if a lie is what this was. And for those 10 days, nobody inside that palace could have told you which way it was going to break. Day 10 arrived, and the steward went looking for the disaster he had been dreading. He did not find it. What he found instead, when he lined the 4 boys up beside the young men who had spent those same 10 days eating from the king's kitchen, was the last thing on earth he expected. Daniel and his friends looked better. Not merely holding on, not merely scraping by on rabbit food while the real men ate real meals. Better. The old text does not soften it and does not hedge. Their faces appeared healthier and better nourished than all the young men who had been eating the royal food. Fuller, brighter, more alive. Sit for a second with how strange that must have looked to a man of the ancient world. He had just watched 4 teenagers eat nothing but plants and drink nothing but water for 10 straight days, while everyone around him feasted on meat and wine, and it was the plant eaters who came out glowing. Everything he had assumed about where human strength comes from had just been quietly turned upside down in his own courtyard, in front of his own eyes. You can almost picture the scene, the steward moving slowly down the line, glancing from one group to the other, already bracing himself, already rehearsing the excuse he would have to give the king, and then stopping, looking again, because the 4 he had lost sleep over did not look deprived at all. They looked rested, clear-eyed, and steady on their feet. It was the ones who had been eating like princes, who looked a little heavy, a little dull, a little worn down by all that richness. The evidence was not written on a chart or tucked into a number. It was written plainly across 8 young faces, and it said the exact opposite of everything he had feared. He did not argue with what he saw. He did the only sensible thing left to him. He took away their portion of the royal food and the wine they were meant to drink, this time for good, and he kept bringing them vegetables. The test was finished. The result had settled it. And notice what the steward actually did with that relief. He did not treat it as a lucky fluke to be quietly forgotten. He changed his practice. From that day forward, he simply kept taking the rich food away and kept bringing the plain food because a careful man does not argue with a result he can see with his own eyes morning after morning on 4 healthy faces. In one quiet decision, a low-ranking official had run a trial, read the outcome, and let the outcome change what he did next. That is the entire engine of science, arriving centuries early, turning over in a back kitchen in Babylon, all because 4 boys refused a menu. And this is the moment a small story about a palace kitchen cracks open into something much larger, because those 10 days were only the opening act. The 4 boys stayed on that food for the rest of their training. Not 10 days, the whole long stretch of it. And when the 3 years were up, every young man in the program was brought before Nebuchadnezzar himself, so the king could look his future advisors in the eye and question them for himself. He talked with all of them, and out of that entire class, gathered from the conquered nations and trained by the sharpest minds in Babylon, 4 names stood above every other: Daniel and his 3 friends. The text says the king found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. There is that number again, 10. 10 days at the start, 10 times better at the end. The old text does not seem to hand you the same number twice by accident. And these were not 4 boys who merely scraped through their schooling and then melted back into the crowd. Daniel walked out of that program and into a life that would outlast the empire which had captured him. He would stand in front of that same king and describe a dream the king had refused to tell anyone, and then unlock its meaning. A feat that made the seasoned palace magicians look like children playing at wisdom. He would be lifted up to govern a whole province of Babylon and to sit at the head of all its wise men. And he would still be standing, gray-haired, decades and whole empires later. The boy who ate his vegetables in a corner became the one man a line of kings could not do without. And the seed of all of it is sitting right there in that first small refusal at the table. Now, the story itself gives the credit plainly, and honesty demands we keep it in the frame. It says God gave these 4 young men knowledge and understanding. The diet is never sold as a magic trick. Daniel did not eat vegetables in order to win a competition. He ate them to keep a border. And the strength and the sharpness arrived as a gift laid on top of the faithfulness. That is the story on its own terms, and it deserves to be respected as it stands. But here is the question a certain kind of modern mind simply cannot leave alone. Set the miracle to one side for a moment, not to deny it, only to ask something narrower, purely on the level of the body. Could a diet like that actually do what the text describes? Could vegetables and plain water really leave a person healthier than rich meat and wine in a way you could measure with instruments and write on a chart? For almost all of history, nobody could answer that. You cannot run a blood panel on a boy who lived 26 centuries ago. So somebody decided to run it on people who are alive right now. A research team at the University of Memphis, led by an exercise and nutrition scientist named Richard Bloomer, took the pattern of eating described in Daniel's story and turned it into something they could actually test in a lab. They called it, fittingly, the Daniel Fast. The rules followed the spirit of the old text closely. Plants, whole and unprocessed, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans and other legumes, nuts, seeds, no meat, no wine, no alcohol of any kind, nothing artificial poured in, water as the drink. They gathered ordinary adults, men and women off the street, put them on that way of eating, and measured what happened inside their bodies across about 3 weeks. The results, published around the year 2010, are the reason this ancient story keeps getting pulled back into the conversation. Then blood pressure came down, cholesterol came down, and the LDL cholesterol in particular, the kind that builds up along the walls of your arteries and slowly narrows them, dropped in a way that genuinely matters for the heart. Insulin came down, and the body's handling of blood sugar improved, which is one of the single most valuable things a person can shift if they are trying to keep diabetes at arm's length. And the markers of inflammation and oxidative stress, that quiet cellular wear and tear sitting underneath so many long, slow diseases, moved in the direction you would hope for, in a matter of weeks, on plants and water, just as an ancient steward had watched it happen on 4 young faces in a courtyard. Every item on that list, the blood pressure, the cholesterol, the blood sugar, the inflammation, is one of the quiet drivers a doctor today watches for behind the heart attacks and the strokes and the slow decline, and all of them bent the right way at once, from nothing more exotic than plants and water. Now, honesty again, because a true story is always stronger when you refuse to oversell it. The modern study was not a perfect copy of whatever Daniel actually ate. It ran for about 3 weeks rather than 10 days, and it was built as a fast, a deliberate season with a beginning and an end, not a claim that a person should eat it this exact way for the rest of their life. Some researchers also point to a wrinkle worth naming. Along with the harmful LDL cholesterol, the helpful HDL cholesterol dipped as well, and there is a real and ongoing scientific conversation about what that trade-off means over the long run. This was a snapshot, not the final word on anything. None of that erases the result. It simply keeps it honest and human-sized. But step back and let the shape of the thing land on you. Take away the rich food. Take away the wine. Lean the whole diet onto plants and water. And a human body, ancient or modern, tends to answer in the same language. Steadier blood sugar, calmer arteries, lower inflammation, a face that looks more alive than it did before. Why does it work? The pieces stop being mysterious the moment you lay them out on the table. Vegetables and legumes are loaded with fiber, and fiber acts like a brake on sugar, slowing how fast it slips into the blood, flattening the sharp spike and the hard crash that follow a heavy meal. Steadier sugar means steadier energy and far less of the wear that comes from riding that roller coaster 3 times a day, every day for years. Take the wine away, and the liver, the body's overworked cleanup crew, finally gets a long stretch of quiet in which to catch up on its real work. And the deep colors packed into vegetables, the reds and greens and purples, carry compounds that help calm inflammation, and some of them help the blood vessels themselves relax and widen, which eases the pressure pushing against those walls. The ancient world could not have named a single one of those mechanisms. It did not need to. It could read the answer straight off a face after 10 days. And Daniel's plate was never some strange outlier in a world of the Bible. Step back and look at how these people actually ate across most of their history, and the same shape shows up again and again. Bread from whole ancient grains. Lentils and beans simmered slowly into stew, the very dish Esau once traded his birthright to get a bowl of. Olive oil in the place of heavy animal fat. Figs, dates, pomegranates, herbs pulled straight from the ground. A homeland described over and over as a land flowing with milk and honey, not a land flowing with roasted meat and strong wine. Daniel was not inventing some clever new diet inside that palace. He was refusing to abandon an old one. He was holding on to the ordinary food of his people against the extraordinary food of an empire. And it turned out the ordinary food was quietly the stronger of the two all along. And that is the part I keep circling back to. Now think about what actually happened here. Stripped all the way down to the bone. A teenager robbed of his home and his family and even his name made a decision that had nothing to do with health. He was not counting grams of fiber. He had never once heard the word inflammation. He was guarding something he believed was sacred, drawing a single line he would not let a foreign empire step across. And on the far side of that decision, waiting for him like a gift he never thought to ask for, stood a body that outperformed every young man who had chosen the easier, richer road. That is worth sitting with, because it quietly flips the way most of us think about our own plates. We tend to treat eating well as a grim little transaction. Give up the thing you want now, collect a bit more health somewhere down the line, and resent the trade the entire way through. Daniel's story runs in the opposite direction. The health was never the point of it. It was the overflow. It came to a young man who was reaching for something higher than his own comfort, and it arrived quietly, without him ever sitting down to bargain for it. And you do not have to be marched into Babylon to put it to the test. You are carrying the same body those 4 boys carried, running on the same ancient rules it has always run on. You could take 10 days, Daniel's own number, and do something close to what he did. Lean your meals toward plants. Pour a glass of water where something heavier usually goes. Let the rich, processed, sugar-spiking food step back and sit down for a little while. And then, like that nervous steward, look honestly at your own face in the mirror. Watch your energy hold across a long afternoon. Notice the way you fall asleep at night. 10 days is long enough for a body to start answering the question, exactly the way it answered inside that courtyard. Here is what that could look like, in the plainest possible terms. A bowl of oats or a slice of whole grain bread in the morning instead of something sugary that leaves you empty an hour later. Beans, lentils, and a good pile of vegetables carrying the middle of your day, dressed with olive oil rather than heavy fat. A piece of fruit when the craving for something sweet shows up. Water or a plain tea sitting where the wine or the soda used to sit. Nothing exotic, nothing that needs a special shop or a deep wallet. The same humble ingredients within reach of a captive 26 centuries ago are on ordinary grocery shelves right now, carrying the very same quiet power. Because the oldest recorded experiment on the human body was not run in a laboratory full of white coats and clipboards. It was run by one frightened steward and 4 stubborn boys who changed a single thing and then watched closely to see what would happen. They wrote the result down, and they kept it. And 2,500 years later, with all of our instruments and all our careful studies, we keep arriving back at the very same quiet finding they landed on in 10 days. The food that looked weak made them strong. The choice that should have cost Daniel everything ended him more than the king's table ever could have. And the number the old text pressed into your hand twice, the 10 and then the 10, turns out to be pointing at something real, not magic. Not a fairy tale dressed up in religious language, just a plain truth about the human body that was written down long before anyone owned the tools to prove it. Sitting quietly inside an old story the whole time, patient, waiting all these centuries for the rest of us to catch up